Mark, Jenna, and Leo set out for a weekend of hiking in a remote forest. It was Jenna's idea to explore a lesser-known trail that ended at an abandoned campsite. According to local legend, the site had been used decades ago by a group of campers who vanished without a trace. Undeterred by the eerie stories, they hiked deep into the woods, their laughter cutting through the stillness. By the time they reached the campsite, dusk was settling in. The site consisted of crumbling fire pits, a few rotting benches, and a rusted sign that read, "Camp Willowbrook." The place seemed frozen in time, but they were too tired to care. They set up their tents, built a small fire, and settled in for the night. As darkness fell, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just silence. The air felt heavy, pressing down on them like an invisible weight. Jenna tried to laugh it off, suggesting that the forest was simply too remote for wildlife. Mark and Leo nodded, but their uneasy glances betrayed their discomfort. Around midnight, Leo excused himself to use the bathroom. He walked a few yards into the woods, flashlight in hand. Minutes passed, then half an hour. Mark and Jenna called out for him, but there was no response. Concerned, they grabbed their flashlights and ventured into the woods to search for him. The deeper they went, the more disoriented they felt. The forest seemed to twist and shift around them. Just as panic began to set in, they found Leo standing motionless by a tree, his flashlight lying at his feet. His eyes were wide, his face pale. "Leo, what happened?" Mark asked, shaking his shoulder. Leo didn't respond. He slowly turned his head toward them, his expression blank. Then, in a voice that wasn't his own, he whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." Before they could react, the forest around them seemed to come alive with whispers. Voices, soft and chilling, filled the air, saying things they couldn't understand. The ground beneath them felt like it was pulsing, and the trees seemed to lean closer. They dragged Leo back to the campsite, but the whispers followed them. The fire had gone out, and their tents were ripped to shreds. Terrified, they decided to leave immediately, even in the dead of night. As they hurried back toward the trail, the whispers grew louder, morphing into anguished screams. Just when they thought they would be consumed by the cacophony, they broke through the tree line and stumbled onto the main road. The forest fell silent behind them. They never spoke of that night again. Months later, Mark found an old newspaper clipping about Camp Willowbrook. It mentioned the campers who had vanished, but what caught his eye was a small detail. One of the missing campers was named Leo. Every year, the Stevens family went on a camping trip to Pine Hollow. This time, they decided to venture deeper into the woods than ever before, hoping to escape the usual crowded spots. They found a secluded clearing beside a small lake, set up their tents, and spent the day fishing and exploring. That evening, as they sat around the campfire, 10-year-old Emma pointed at the woods. "Who's that?" she asked, her voice curious. Her parents, Mike and Laura, turned to look but saw nothing. "There's no one there, sweetie," Laura said, brushing it off. Emma insisted she had seen a man standing between the trees. Her parents exchanged uneasy glances, but chalked it up to her imagination. After all, they were miles away from the nearest trail. Later that night, as the family slept, Mike was jolted awake by a strange noise, a low, guttural growl, followed by a sound like rustling leaves. He sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The noise seemed to circle their campsite, moving closer, then farther away. He woke Laura, and they both peered out of the tent. The campfire had burned down to embers, casting flickering shadows. For a moment, everything was still. Then, from the edge of the clearing, a tall, gaunt figure stepped into view. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and it stood unnaturally still, watching them. Mike scrambled to grab the flashlight, but when he turned it on, the figure was gone. The growling noise resumed, this time from the opposite side of the camp. It was as if whatever was out there could move impossibly fast. "We need to leave," Laura whispered, her voice trembling. They woke Emma, packed up in record time, and made their way to their car. As they walked, the growling followed them, always just out of sight. Once in the car, Mike floored it, driving through the winding forest road. Just as they thought they were safe, Emma gasped. "He's following us," she whispered, pointing out the rear window. In the distance, barely visible in the moonlight, the figure stood in the middle of the road, watching as their taillights disappeared into the night. Ben and his friends, Lisa, Matt, and Kelly, decided to go camping for the weekend. They found a nice spot deep in the forest, far from the noise of the city. The place was perfect. A wide clearing with a view of the stars and a quiet lake nearby. After setting up their tents, they gathered wood for a campfire. As the sun went down, they sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The mood was light and happy until Kelly spoke up. "Did you guys hear about the ghost story from this forest?" she asked, her eyes glinting in the firelight. Ben rolled his eyes. "Come on, Kelly. We're here to have fun, not to get scared." "I'm serious," Kelly said. "They say a girl disappeared in these woods years ago. Some campers claim to have seen her sitting by their fire at night, but when they looked again, she was gone." Lisa shivered. "That's creepy. Don't say stuff like that." They all laughed nervously and moved on to other topics. As the night deepened, the fire began to die down, and one by one they went to their tents to sleep. Only Ben stayed up, poking at the embers with a stick and enjoying the peace. Just as he was about to head to his tent, he heard a soft rustling sound. He looked up and froze. Across the fire on the other side of the clearing sat a girl. She was young, maybe around 10 years old, with long dark hair and pale skin. She wore a simple white dress, and her hands rested in her lap. Ben's heart raced. He hadn't heard anyone approach, and they were miles from any other campsite. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The girl sat perfectly still, staring into the dying fire. Finally, Ben found his voice. "Hey, are you lost? Where are your parents?" The girl didn't respond. She didn't even look at him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the fire. Ben stood up, his legs shaky. "Do you need help?" he asked, louder this time. Still, the girl didn't move. Feeling a growing sense of dread, Ben stepped around the fire to get closer, but as he did, the girl slowly turned her head to look at him. Her eyes were dark, almost black, and filled with a sadness that sent chills down his spine. Before Ben could say anything else, the girl spoke in a soft, hollow voice. "It's so cold." Then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. Ben stumbled back, his heart pounding. He looked around the clearing, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had never been there. Trembling, he hurried to wake his friends. "There was a girl!" he exclaimed, shaking Matt awake. "She was sitting by the fire." Matt groaned and sat up. "What are you talking about? Are you dreaming?" "I'm serious," Ben said, his voice shaking. "She was right there, and then she disappeared." By now, Lisa and Kelly were awake too. They followed Ben outside, but the clearing was empty. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the forest was silent. "You probably imagined it," Lisa said, though she looked uneasy. "I know what I saw," Ben insisted. "She said, 'It's so cold,' and then she vanished." The group stayed up the rest of the night, too scared to sleep. When dawn finally came, they decided to pack up and leave. As they gathered their things, Ben noticed something by the fire pit. It was a small, old-fashioned doll, its dress scorched as if it had been too close to the flames. "Did any of you bring this?" Ben asked, holding up the doll. Everyone shook their heads. Feeling uneasy, they left the doll where it was and hurried back to their car. As they drove away, none of them spoke. The forest seemed to watch them, the trees standing like silent sentinels. That night, back in his apartment, Ben couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the girl and her haunting eyes. Was it just the darkness playing tricks on him? Or had he crossed a line he shouldn't have? Four college friends, Tom, Sarah, Jake, and Megan, set out to explore a trail they had read about online. It was said to lead to a hidden waterfall, but few had ever found it. The online descriptions were tantalizing, claiming the waterfall had mystical properties, and some whispered of strange happenings along the path. Armed with a GPS, a map, and an adventurous spirit, they were confident they could reach it. The beginning of the trail was pristine, the air crisp, and the forest alive with the sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves. The path was clearly marked with red tape on trees, but as they ventured deeper into the woods, the markers became sparse. Soon the trail grew overgrown, and the natural beauty of the place felt more oppressive. Strange, jagged symbols began to appear carved into tree trunks, odd shapes, circles within circles, broken lines, and spirals. Jake joked that they had stumbled onto a witch's trail, but his laughter sounded hollow, as if the joke didn't quite reach his eyes. The forest felt too quiet, almost as though it was holding its breath. As they pressed on, the air grew heavy, and the temperature dropped unexpectedly, despite the clear skies above. They consulted their GPS, but it began to malfunction, leading them in strange directions. One moment, it showed them on a part of the trail they hadn't even walked yet. The next, it led them to an empty, unmarked space where no path existed. The map they'd brought was of no use. Some landmarks were missing, and others didn't match what they saw before them. "Let's just head back," Megan said, her voice tight with unease. But when they turned around, the way they'd come had vanished. Thick underbrush, tangled vines, and enormous trees now blocked their path. It was as if the forest had rearranged itself in the time it took them to look away. Panic set in as the sky darkened. The oppressive silence was replaced by faint rustling in the bushes behind them, but when they turned to look, no one was there. The forest was closing in around them, its shadows growing longer and more menacing. As they stumbled forward, trying to retrace their steps, they could hear footsteps trailing behind them, mimicking their movements. But each time they stopped to look, the footsteps stopped as well. Hours passed, and the sun finally dipped beneath the horizon. They were lost. The woods stretched out in all directions, no familiar landmarks in sight. Their only source of light was a flickering flashlight that seemed to do little against the growing darkness. It was then that they saw the clearing, just as they thought they might go mad from exhaustion. In the center of the clearing stood a weathered wooden sign. The same strange symbols they'd seen on the trees were carved into the wood. Beneath the symbols were rough letters, gouged deep into the surface, as if carved by some desperate hand. "You're already lost." The words seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. The air grew thick with dread, and their breaths quickened. They tried to speak, but their voices felt strangled, as if the forest itself was choking their words. The light from their flashlight flickered out, and they were plunged into darkness. In the blackness they heard whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from every direction. But no matter how hard they strained their eyes, there was no one to be seen. I can't," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to get out of here." The group set up a small campfire, the crackling flames offering only the smallest comfort. But sleep was impossible. Every so often they heard laughter, soft, high-pitched, almost childlike, but always distant, echoing through the trees. It wasn't the laughter of any of them. It felt ancient, terrifying. They each took turns keeping watch, but every time they closed their eyes, the whispers and the laughter became louder, as if drawing closer. By dawn, the forest had changed. The trees seemed to loom taller, their branches twisting like fingers. The path, which had been absent the night before, now appeared once again, but it led in an unfamiliar direction, one none of them recognized. They had no choice but to follow it, their minds too fogged by exhaustion and fear to make a better decision. They walked for what felt like hours, the trail becoming steeper and more treacherous. As they rounded a bend, they were startled to see a road up ahead, a narrow, deserted road far from where they had parked their car. A passing driver, an older man with hollow eyes, gave them a strange look but offered them a ride back into town. The friends accepted without hesitation, eager to escape the nightmare they had found themselves in. But as they tried to retrace their steps later, to show others the trail they had walked, it was gone. The path, the strange symbols, the eerie clearing, they had all disappeared. Local authorities dismissed their story, chalking it up to a bad experience in the woods. But the group knew better. They had left, yes, but only because the trail had allowed them to. That night, Tom woke up in a cold sweat. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something that had been with them in the woods, following them from the moment they'd set foot on the trail. He felt a presence in his room, something ancient and waiting. When he looked out his window, there on the edge of the forest were the symbols once again, glowing faintly in the dark, and beneath them, in rough, jagged letters, was a message for him. You're never truly free.